I'm here today with Professor Andrew Gallup of the State University of New York Polytechnic Institute. Andrew is an evolutionary psychologist, and he's going to join us in a conversation about infidelity. So, getting right into it, what are some factors that underlie sexual behavior in males and females?
Yeah, so men and women tend to differ pretty fundamentally in three properties when it comes to reproductive biology. The first being parental investment. So Robert Trivers is most known for his development of the theory of parental investment, where he identified that in sexually reproducing species, one sex typically has a greater obligatory investment in reproduction. And within mammals, humans included, that is overwhelmingly the case that females have that greater investment in terms of pregnancy and lactation as being a cost to reproduction that females entail that males don't. So there's an asymmetry there for parental investment. The second of the three factors is reproductive potential. So this comes down to the production and availability of gametes. So males produce vast amounts of sperm and therefore have a much higher reproductive potential than do women, which are constrained by ovulatory cycles, or in other species, periods of estrus, when they're only reproductively viable during certain periods of time. And then after conception, females are constrained in their reproduction again through those lactation or pregnancy, gestation periods, and then subsequent lactation of young thereafter. While males have the opportunity to potentially reproduce throughout their reproductive lifespan once they are sexually mature. They're not constrained in the same way that women are. And in fact, research suggests that male reproductive rates are simply constrained by availability to accessible females. So that is another asymmetry. And the third asymmetry comes down to parental certainty. And what I mean by that is certainty in the genetic relatedness to offspring following reproduction. So maternity is always certain due to internal fertilization in women. Woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to her young. She's always certain that those offspring carry her genes. She may not be thinking about this consciously, but during the course of evolution, there was no factors that would have contributed to uncertainty and those being her offspring. For males, on the other hand, the internal fertilization in the opposite sex produces the opportunity for infidelity or aspects of adultery to contribute to the prospect that a male might be ultimately fathering a child that he is not genetically related to. In other words, could have been sired by another male. He doesn't carry that baby himself or give birth to that baby, and therefore the probability of him sharing genes in common with the child is always going to be less than 1. Right? There could be some probability that that child isn't his in the event that the female commits infidelity. Okay? So that paternal uncertainty for men versus women produces that third asymmetry. And when you can take into account these three factors, again, parental investment, reproductive potential, and parental certainty, those differences between men and women contribute to the vast array of differences in human sexual behavior that we see today.
Oh, excellent. So, considering they have differences in sexual behavior, they probably select mates based on different criteria. So what do females typically base their choice on?
Yeah, so based on the limited reproductive potential, relatively speaking, and the greater parental investment that women have in the reproductive act, women are much more concerned with particular traits when selecting mates. So these types of traits come into two different categories. These categories are what we call direct benefits and indirect benefits that women can acquire from certain mates. So the direct benefits refers to any types of tangible resources that a male might be able to provide a woman as a reproductive partner. These could be direct financial resources, access to certain types of non-human animals territories or shelters, any types of, again, tangible resources that could benefit the woman and her offspring during rearing. Indirect benefits refer to benefits that are going to be passed on to offspring through genetic quality factors. So males that might have indicators of good genes or certain types of physical attributes, formidability, prowess, attractiveness, that don't necessarily provide the woman with a direct benefit, but if passed on to her offspring, could provide benefits to her offspring in terms of reproduction.
So things like a peacock, essentially, where they're essentially like a sperm donor. It doesn't really contribute much to parental care, but ultimately she'll have sexy sons if she mates with this individual. So he might not provide any kind of direct benefit to her, but she'll benefit because of having superior offspring, essentially.
Exactly, yeah. So the peacock is the classic example of a direct benefit, provides no parental care whatsoever, but peacocks with these large tail feathers and most vibrant colors are found most attractive by females. Females will like to mate with them in the hopes that their sons subsequently will also carry those traits and have high reproductive success themselves.
Okay, so where does infidelity fit in this picture?
Yeah, so those three fundamental differences in reproductive biology produce some conflict between the sexes, which in many respects is going to lead to or relationships breaking up, or instances of infidelity or adultery occurring within relationships. So a lot of research has investigated, some of the reasons why men and women cheat on their partners, whether it's simply in a male scenario, to have greater access to reproductive opportunities that might be constrained in a monogamous relationship, to examples of cheating among women, where they're interested in acquiring either direct or indirect benefits from a potential mate, an extra pair mate. So cheating with a man that might have greater access to resources that can provide those direct benefits, or cheating with a man that might have indicators of genetic quality that might be able to bestow her offspring with those indirect benefits. And there are also scenarios in which cheating might occur as a means of mate switching. So an opportunity to connect and develop a romantic relationship with someone else that might be better suited or a better match for you than the current partner.
So in those scenarios where they're mate switching, they're probably choosing a mate that has similar kind of qualities, maybe than the current mate. But in the second scenario you mentioned, where they might sort of look for some features in one and some features in the partner that they're committing infidelity with, those males should probably be kind of express different sort of traits.
Yes.
So does this fit in the notion of cads and dads?
Yeah. So this notion of cads and dads. So dads being males that are nurturing, good parents, nice providers to the family and offspring, being very important for females due to that higher parental investment that they have.
Yeah.
So having a male in the relationship that can provide and also help in rearing the offspring is really, really important. It's a trait that's sought after undoubtedly by women. But in many cases, a male that has those traits might also have trade-offs and not be rated so high in other categories or scenarios in which women are also find attractive, such as indicators of genetic quality, indicators of physical attributes that are related to indirect benefits that can be passed on to offspring. And so that is more associated with this CAD type of characteristic, where women want to raise a family with a dad, but they might be interested in outside extra pair copulations or affairs with this CAD to seek out benefits that might not be present in the existing monogamous relationship.
So essentially, if you were going to a female going to a sperm clinic to artificially inseminate, then she would probably maybe go for these CAD type features in those regards.
Yeah, so in cases of infidelity, it seems that women tend to prefer traits associated with these CAD-like characteristics, more masculine characteristics in facial structure and body morphology. Indicators of higher testosterone are often perceived as more attractive in extra pair mating opportunities for women. So there is pretty good evidence to suggest there are women that commit infidelity are interested in these good gene indicators.
So I can't imagine infidelity really going over well for either sex that's involved.
No, it certainly doesn't. The formation of committed romantic relationships is obviously something that's really, really costly and takes a lot of time and attention, and instances of infidelity or adultery are often perceived as very, very distressful. Hard to imagine scenarios that are more distressful than your committed romantic partner cheating on you. So both men and women are very distressed by scenarios of infidelity. Interestingly, however, there still does appear to be a sex difference in the psychological distress that results from infidelity. And then, again, this is related to those fundamental differences we talked about in the beginning. David Buss has extensively researched differences in jealousy as a result of infidelity in men and women, and he has categorized two different types of infidelity. Sexual infidelity, which is discovering that your committed partner had sexual intercourse with someone else, and instances of emotional infidelity, where it's discovering that your committed partner has fallen in love with someone else. And while both of these scenarios are very distressing for men and women, if asked to identify which one is more distressing, thinking about your partner having sex with someone else, or thinking about your partner falling in love with someone else, studies have consistently shown that women become more distressed by the prospect of their committed partner falling in love with someone else, while men become more distressed with the idea of their committed partner having sex with someone else. Now, why are those differences present? Well, the outcome for males, I think, is easily understood in terms of parental certainty, and in the male case, parental uncertainty. And that is that an instance of infidelity that results in sexual intercourse brings up the prospect that a male could be cuckolded, or, in other words, the female could be impregnated by another male's sperm, and therefore have a baby that is genetically unrelated to that resident male. And during human evolutionary history, this would have been tremendously costly for men. You would have expected really strong selective pressure to operate on psychological and behavioral mechanisms in men to curb sexual infidelity, to reduce that, because the cost of cuckoldry and investing in offspring that they're not genetically related to would have been so detrimental, relatively speaking. For women, the focus or the enhanced distress over instances of emotional infidelity rather than sexual infidelity, on average, can be also understood based on those fundamental differences in human reproductive biology. The greater obligatory parental investment that women have requires investment and resources and provisioning by committed romantic partners in a relationship. And therefore, having a child, a human baby, is so costly and requires cooperative of care and rearing and provisioning that the idea of their committed partner falling in love with someone else brings up the prospect that man could leave and enter a committed relationship and therefore divert resources, attention, and provisioning away from that existing relationship and family unit, potentially. So in other words, a woman could become abandoned in that event, and that abandonment is likely to be more costly for a woman than it would be for a man.
So getting back to the infidelity scenario, are there any evidence of adaptations for infidelity?
Yeah, so researchers have examined, do instances of infidelity or the proclivity to engage in infidelity, does that occur under circumstances that might be adaptive for the males or females? And for women, for example, there is evidence to suggest that instance and extra pair copulations with men are more likely to occur during fertile stages of the menstrual cycle, and therefore during periods of time that are more likely to result in conception.
So essentially like ovulation, like during
ovulation. Exactly. When women are in the ovulatory phase of their menstrual cycle, obviously the chances of conception are greatest. And they show greater sexual interest and arousal during this period of the cycle. And research suggests that they also are more likely to engage in infidelity during this stage of their menstrual cycle. And furthermore, research suggests that they're less likely to use a condom in cases in which they are committing infidelity during this high fertility phase of their menstrual cycle. And moreover, they're more likely to experience orgasms during instances of infidelity during this peak period of fertility. So, taking into account those three features, they're more likely to engage in infidelity while they're ovulating, more likely or less likely to utilize methods of contraception during that time, and more likely to orgasm during these instances. Collectively, all increase the likelihood of conception. In other words, that a woman becomes pregnant as a result of those acts of infidelity.
So orgasms actually contribute to increase the probability of fertilization?
Well, it remains kind of an area that is controversial, functionality of female orgasm. But there are lines of evidence to suggest that the contractions that occur during female orgasm might function to increase the uptake of sperm into the female's reproductive tract, and therefore increasing the likelihood that those sperm fertilize the eggs.
Oh, that's incredible. I mean. So considering that all of these features for infidelity on the female side to increase the probability of fertilization by this extra pair mate, there must be adaptations on the male side to try to prevent this from occurring, or if it does occur, to try to prevent it resulting in fertilization.
Yeah, so again, talking about those differences in parental certainty, the great costs that males would face from instances of cuckoldry have undoubtedly selected for psychological and behavioral mechanisms to reduce the incidence of female infidelity, to identify cases of infidelity, and potentially countermeasures to evaluate provisioning and care after a suspected act of infidelity has occurred. So males show enhanced instances of sexual jealousy that we talked about, and male sexual jealousy is unfortunately contributes to higher incidence of domestic abuse and violence within relationships. In addition, males are more likely to demonstrate guarding of mates, particularly during times of peak fertility and ovulation, and higher instances of mate monitoring, where they call and check in on mates, again, during these instances of peak fertility. And these mechanisms, again, likely are adaptive for men in simply curbing or reducing the risk of cuckoldry.
And there has been some evidence suggesting that domestic violence is sort of linked to the perceived relation of the male to the offspring that's in the home, essentially.
Yeah, there has been quite a bit of research, in fact, showing by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, initially demonstrating that suspected cases of infidelity significantly contribute to risks of domestic violence, abuse, and even homicide of committed romantic partners.
I remember also seeing something, and it was an interesting observation where they analyzed recordings, video recordings of what happened in the labor room, and it turned out that in all cases, the family of the female expressed to the male how much the offspring looks like the father, but in none of the cases did they even express that it looks like the mother at all.
Yeah, that's research from Wilson and Daly as well, examining sex differences in the extended kin, and again, as would be expected by parental uncertainty for males, the female members of the female family are more likely to emphasize that the baby looks like the dad, and consciously or unconsciously, likely these differences have evolved to promote continued provisioning and care from the father into the offspring if there are any types of suspected infidelity or uncertainty about the genetic relatedness to the offspring.
Oh, that's interesting. So as a biologist, I'm aware of many morphological adaptations amongst males to increase the likelihood that they are the father or they're the genetic contributor to the offspring. And these are things such as features to male genitalia, for example, in wolves where the genitals will swell inside of the female after ejaculation. It sort of prevents another male from going in there afterwards. Even the water striders, which we've researched together, the males will reside in the back of the female for a matter of hours, for even over a day, and that prevents other males from essentially being able to acquire that female. And even we find things in the sperm itself. Fruit fly is very well known for this, a model organism in this field, where males will produce these accessory proteins that will sometimes modify female behavior. They could kill rival male sperm, which will increase the chance that their sperm is going to be the successful one. And also, in some cases, it will form a plug in the back of the female, so therefore a mother male simply can't have access to it. Do we see any sort of comparable or comparable adaptations in human males?
Yeah, I think taking a comparative perspective is really important in thinking about the evolution of human psychology and behavior. And comparatively, when we look at apes and other apes, for example, chimpanzees, gorillas, and analyzing differences in their reproductive biology, their mating systems, and their genital morphology gives rise to important insights about human evolution. So for example, gorillas, male gorillas, silverback gorillas, hold a harem and have reproductive access over all females in that group. And therefore, in the absence of being overthrown by another silverback gorilla, there's little to no mating competition within that mating unit. So, inconsistent with the very large body size and clear formidability that gorillas have, they actually have comparatively really small genitalia. And for example, their testes are disproportionately smaller than we would expect for a primate that size. But we can understand that based on the mating system. They don't need to devote a lot of energy into creating large testes that have greater volumes of sperm because none of the females in their group are having potential instances of infidelity or having extra-pair copulations, and therefore there's no need to dedicate resources into that development. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, are well known for being very promiscuous and multiple maters. So females, when they come into estrus, will mate with multiple males within short succession. And in instances where there are these multiple matings during peak fertility, males compete with one another through sperm competition. So male chimpanzees that leave greater numbers of sperm in the female reproductive tract are more likely to sire offspring and impregnate those females. So we see that in chimpanzees, their testes have evolved to be really, really large. Again, disproportionately larger than we would expect given their body size for a typical primate. So, just simply looking at the genital morphology of these species provides a wealth of information about their mating systems and the potential risks of non-paternity in offspring. Now, in the human case, our genitals also provide some evidence or provide some insight into our mating system. So, the male testes in humans are more comparable to chimpanzees. They're not nearly as large as chimpanzees, but they're larger than gorillas, which our bodies, the male body size is far smaller than the gorilla, yet we have much larger testes, and our sperm counts are also much larger, suggesting an evolutionary history of multiple mating and non-paternity. In other words, that during human evolutionary history, sperm competition was a relevant and significant selective pressure on our species. So males that competed with other males through sperm competition were more likely to leave more descendants. Okay, and that suggests that there was a history of infidelity and multiple mating in the human lineage. The other aspect of genital morphology is the penis when it comes to men. And the human penis is fundamentally distinct from that of the other great apes. For one, it is much, much larger. So the human penis is considerably longer than any of the other great apes. And it also has a distinct morphology. So the head or the glans of the penis is larger in comparison to the shaft of the penis, which creates what's called the coronal ridge. And these two distinct features, the large glans in relation to the shaft that produces this ridge, is comparable, in fact, to many non-human animal species in looking at their penile morphologies. And what we find across the board is that species that have penile morphology that's comparable in that way tend to have instances of multiple mating, and the morphology of the penis in this case might function in displacing semen that may be residing in the female's reproductive tract. So, in other words, having this distinct morphology of the penis might help to scoop out or remove existing sperm and semen during the active intercourse itself.
Oh, interesting. How does anyone go about testing the functionality of this? I can't imagine it's that easy.
Yeah, so unlike non-human animals, insects, which have been widely studied in this regard, you can do invasive experiments. You can actually have males and females mate and have multiple matings and examine the proportion of semen that were from the first mating versus the second mating. You can measure semen that might have been displaced. Ethically, we can't do those studies with humans, nor would we even conceive of that. So what we've done is tried to provide some kind of measurements of these types of outcomes through laboratory manipulations. And in fact, artificial genitalia have been used. So some researchers, for example, have gone out and purchased artificial genitals, dildos and artificial female vaginas, and they've tried to replicate the features of human semen, the viscosity and textural features of semen by mixing together water and flour. and inserting this into the female genitals, these artificial genitals, and then inserting these male genitals that have these distinct coronal ridges that are resembling the human penis versus male artificial genitals that don't have that distinct feature or have the coronal ridge has been manipulated or removed experimentally in the lab. And what they find is that the male artificial genitals that most take on the most naturalistic features in that having that coronal ridge and that large glands actually do function to remove the semen that's present in the female reproductive tract. And they find that, in fact, the deeper that the genitals are inserted, the more sperm and more semen in particular, or resembling the concocted semen is removed from the artificial female genitals.
Oh, wow.
So just the act of penetration appears to remove semen that would be present if it were present in the female reproductive tract.
And that has a function of depth of thrusting, essentially.
Yeah, so two findings here, that the morphology of the artificial male genital plays a role. Those with the coronal ridge remove more semen. But also the depth of thrusting that's applied is positively correlated with the removal of semen.
This has a lot of behavioral implications that I can imagine.
Yes, it's one thing to demonstrate mechanically in a lab that the insertion of a penis into a vagina can remove fluid that resembles seminal properties. It's another thing to assess, what are the likelihoods, what's the likelihood of multiple mating in which women would have existing semen in their reproductive tract at the time in which a resident male is then having sex with her. And also, does the prospect of infidelity alter the way sexual intercourse occurs? Does it improve, or does it rather increase the depth of thrusting or the vigor of thrusting? So researchers have examined these factors, and they found that instances of multiple mating, where a woman will have sex with more than one man within a 24 to 48 hour window, are high enough that it may produce some selective pressure on semen displacement. And instances of infidelity within committed partners, that is, if one or both of the partners suspects an instance of infidelity, in particular if the man has reason to believe that there may have been an instance of infidelity committed by the woman, they've asked the men and women, does sexual intercourse change after that? Does the man thrust more vigorously? Does he thrust deeper during sex following these allegations of infidelity or suspicions of infidelity? And both men and women indicate that they do. That in fact men do thrust deeper on average after those allegations or suspicions of infidelity. And they thrust more vigorously. So the act of sexual intercourse appears to change in ways that align with an increased likelihood of semen displacement.
So that's one thing to just describe the morphology, but the fact that we have behavioral matches to use this sort of tool in these adaptive contexts actually provides more sort of support for this.
Yes, yeah, and again, I think it's important to think about these things, not that they're going on consciously, that men are aware that they can have sex differently to increase his chances of paternity and to reduce the incidence of coupletry. But rather the increased vigor and depth of thrusting rather is just a result of proximate mechanisms that are activated by suspicion or allegations of infidelity that ultimately might function in the outcomes of reducing the likelihood of coupletry.
Yeah, so they also find similar results, I believe, during periods of separation, if there's periods of separation between between individuals.
Yes, you're right. So periods of separation between men and women also increase the depth and vigor of thrusting during subsequent intercourse.
And then, as you said before, this doesn't have to be a conscious sort of thing. So, and someone might argue, well, I just really missed them, or so on and so forth. And that might be the proximate trigger, what motivates you to do it right then and then. But evolutionarily, you're saying that actually that even that missing amount of it, it's not really why you think you did it. It's just a matter of that you actually did it.
Yeah, what selection is going to be operating on are the outcomes of those acts, and if you were to poll men and women, or men for why they're maybe potentially engaging in sex in a different way, they might provide a variety of answers subjectively thinking about it, but the outcome of deeper and more vigorous thrusting is going to reduce the likelihood of cuckoldry and non-paternity, and therefore it's going to be selected against as an outward behavior, despite the fact that proximate mechanisms underlying it might not be in a way directly tied to infidelity or non-paternity.
Yeah, essentially you're measured by what you do. Is it that fertilization essentially it doesn't seem like it happens right away. It seems like there is sort of a window there where she could have actually had sex with another male. He could have ejaculated inside of her, and there still is a window where the resident male could come in 1-2 days later and possibly remove the semen and sort of undo what occurred.
Right. Yeah. So sperm competition can occur, research suggests, between 24 to 48 hours following initial intercourse and ejaculation. So that sperm can live in the female reproductive tract for up to that period, and therefore can potentially fertilize an egg that has descended. So the semen could still be present, and there's still an opportunity for sperm competition to occur within that relatively restricted window.
Is there any evidence of, when we talk about morphological features of the penis itself, is there any investigation into the features of human male semen that actually might influence conception rates?
Yeah, there has been. So male ejaculates occur within spurts. So 3 to 5 spurts are common among men when they ejaculate. In other words, the ejaculate doesn't come off in one flow, but rather comes out intermittently. And so they've looked at basically the production or the way that it flows, and also the composition of those spurts. And they find that the first portions of the ejaculate, the initial spurts, include alkaline types of properties that might serve to neutralize some of the acidic properties of the female reproductive tract in the vagina. And then the intermediate spurts, those in the middle, are the most sperm-laden. Those that are containing the high concentrations of sperm within the ejaculate. But yet follow the ejaculation of the sperm-laden properties of the semen. We see that the last few spurts of the ejaculate actually contain less sperm, or little to no sperm, and in fact properties that are mimic spermicidal chemicals, so chemicals that are actually detrimental to the viability of sperm. Now that makes, that's kind of eye-opening. Why would a man's ejaculate contain spermicidal properties at all? But if we think about the order effects that are occurring here in these portions of the ejaculate, first ejaculate neutralizing, increasing the environment, or making a more habitable environment for the sperm. The intermediate forms of the ejaculate containing the vast amount of sperm, and then that followed by some anti-spermicidal properties that increases the likelihood that the sperm are going to survive by flowing through the female reproductive tract toward the egg, and potentially might serve as a barrier, similar to the plug that you were talking about earlier. This last spurt is also more viscous than the previous spurts, so it's comparable in that it might serve as a plug, but also might hinder the survival of subsequent sperm from rival males.
That's interesting. So essentially, the initial semen entering in makes a more habitable environment for the sperm, and then the last bit in essentially makes it a more hostile environment for the next next male that's going to come in there.
Right.
Oh, that is interesting. So, considering that, the difference in the ejaculate and the morphology of the penis, it seems that you're obviously there to scoop out semen, give your semen the best chance of success. What about the prospects of scooping out your own semen?
Yeah, so that has been thought about. So with the semen displacement hypothesis that we've talked about, some objection to that. One objection is that, well, the morphology of the human penis might scoop out his own semen, right? The male might be removing his own semen, which that wouldn't be adaptive, right? And clearly that wouldn't. However, there are some key features that occur to the man's penis and arousal following ejaculation that significantly reduce the likelihood of semen displacement, his own self-semen displacement. So after a man ejaculates, his penis increases in sensitivity, becomes hypersensitive, and we see that depth and vigor of thrusting immediately diminish right after ejaculation. In addition, there is a refractory period that occurs among men where that following ejaculation, men are either unable or unwilling to again engage in sex for some significant period of time. And again, that would potentially reduce the likelihood of self-semen displacement. So, again, comparing that to a suspicion or allegation of infidelity, where if there might be rival semen in a female's reproductive tract that causes or increases the likelihood of depth and vigor of thrusting after a man has ejaculated and deposited his own semen, depth and vigor of thrusting immediately diminish, and the likelihood of subsequent intercourse with that woman diminish as well.
Now, adaptively speaking, you'd probably suspect that if there was a different female involved, would that impact the refractory period? You imagine the refractory period would be shorter because there's no prospect of scooping out your own semen if it's a different female.
Right. You'd expect the refractory period to occur during a situation that could potentially result in self-semen displacement. But if that's not a possibility, for example, a new female or different females present, you would expect the refractory period to diminish or being eliminated completely. And the refractory period isn't just about necessarily motivation to engage in sex or desire, but it's physiologic. The ability to achieve erection, for example, might just be inhibited. But in the presence of a new female, we would expect that would go away. And in fact, research on non-human animals suggests that's the case. That males can repeatedly engage in intercourse with new females over time, but will have that refractory period if presented with the same female that they've just copulated with.
There's actually a funny anecdotal story surrounding that phenomenon, right? It's called the Coolidge effect.
Yeah, so the reduction in the refractory period, or the elimination of it with the introduction of new females, has been called the Coolidge effect. Based on former United States President Calvin Coolidge. So Calvin Coolidge was touring a poultry farm with his wife, and while touring this poultry farm, it was a chickens were the primary domesticated animal on this farm. Were walking through the grounds and through the barn, and they noticed that this rooster was copulating with multiple hens. He'd copulate with a hen, and then he'd immediately copulate with another hen. And Calvin's wife commented to the farmer and wanted to ask. He said, "Is it common for the rooster to copulate so frequently and just have sex with one hen and immediately have sex right after that?" And the farmer said, oh yes, that's very common. And almost kind of a dig at Calvin, she said, well, maybe you'll tell my husband that. It's making the assumption that maybe her husband isn't able to perform that well in bed, maybe not able to have sex multiple times in a row. And Calvin, hearing this, he said, well, I noticed that the rooster was having sex with one hen, and then he went to another hen, and subsequently to a different hen. Is it always that the rooster has sex with a different hen? And the farmer said, oh yeah, that's always the case. And he said, well, maybe you'll tell that to my wife. So that's how the story goes, and subsequently it's been the reduction in the refractory period with a new female has been called the Coolidge effect.
So we talk about these adaptations of males and females surrounding infidelity. So after the instance of infidelity, considering males have these adaptations to try to undo what occurred, it essentially behooves males and females to essentially act differently following an infidelity. Do we notice any differences in how males approach desire for sex, essentially, and females approach the desire for sex following instances of infidelity?
Yeah, we do. And again, it's consistent with the evolution of a conflict between men and women and the potential advantages and disadvantages to the outcomes of infidelity. So for example, under suspicions or allegations of infidelity by a male suspecting that his female partner has had sex with someone else, an extra pair partner, he shows an increased interest and arousal to engage in in-pair sex, right? So likely to increase the likelihood that he could potentially displace that rival male's semen. So again, within that critical window, 24 to 48 hours within that active sexual infidelity, a male still has an opportunity to engage in semen displacement and sperm competition. So he should show heightened interest in engaging in sex with that in-pair mate, and he does on average. But from the female's perspective, if that extra pair copulation, that active infidelity, is related to trying to increase the odds of conception, she would expect that women would be less likely to want to engage in sex with their in-pair male to exceed that 48-hour window to increase the likelihood that that extra pair sexual opportunity results in conception, and to minimize chances of semen displacement or sperm competition by that in-pair partner. So we see that initially women are resistant to having sex with their in-pair partner following an active infidelity, but after a period of time has elapsed, they actually show an increased likelihood to want to have sex with their in-pair partner. And that increased likelihood has been interpreted as a means of masking that active infidelity. So if the active infidelity occurs and it results in pregnancy, or conception and subsequent pregnancy, yet the woman resists having sex with her partner during that month, there was a likelihood that the male could put two and two together and have a greater suspicion, at least, that this pregnancy is a result of an act of infidelity, because they didn't have sex. How could the baby have been sired? So after that critical window of infidelity, the female has an increased proclivity to engage in in-pair sex, and therefore potentially deceiving the resident male into believing that the subsequent child was his.
Oh, interesting, because you could probably count back so much time, but 9 months later you're not going to remember the resistant, you're going to remember that sort of that heightened sexual activity.
Right.
So these are all mechanisms that exist prior to fertilization or prior to conception. So what happens after the baby is already born? So males, essentially, they could try to increase the chance of being the father before, but after the baby's already born, I'd imagine there'd be mechanisms that exist, or can you describe some mechanisms that exist amongst males where they try to identify if the offspring is theirs and then invest accordingly.
Yeah, so in the absence of DNA testing, which is a recent advent with technology, 99.99% of human evolutionary history, again, males would have some degree, the probability of paternity would have been less than 1, right? And as a result, we would expect that these mechanisms that we've talked about to this point would serve to enhance paternity, reduce the likelihood of cuckoldry, but in cases where there was a conception that resulted from infidelity, there might still be mechanisms that evolved in men to evaluate the likelihood of paternity in offspring that are born as a result. And the primary mechanism that has been examined to evaluate paternity in living children is resemblance to the father, physical features and how they resemble the physical features of the father. So research has looked at this, and there's a variety of research looking at parental resemblance and how that influences investment, provisioning of offspring. And overwhelmingly, the research suggests that the more the baby looks like the dad, or at least the dad perceives the baby to resemble him, the more likely he is to care for that baby, provision that baby, and the less likely he is to suspect that that baby might be a result of an act of adultery or infidelity by the woman.
And interestingly enough, they do find also differences in what males and females look for, even when it comes to adopting a child. So even a child an adopted child who's guaranteed not going to be related to either individual, it seems that males, the number one factor that they consider when it comes to adopting a child is actually resemblance, whereas females tend to gravitate towards more trace that are indicative of health of the baby.
Right, yeah, so if you evaluate the characteristics that men and women look for in potential babies that they could adopt, men place a higher emphasis on wanting to adopt babies that have physical attributes that resemble them. And again, probably unconsciously thinking about mechanisms that may have contributed to reducing paternity or non-paternity and cuckoldry. These are just kind of mechanisms that are expressed in males that are considering behaviors related to parenting. And when thinking about being a parent, the male is more attuned to the physical appearance of the baby and how that might align with his own.
It's almost like an idea of a mismatch, where you're expressing sort of an adaptive behavior, but in sort of the wrong context, or not in the appropriate sort of
adoption
context.
being a novel evolutionary scenario, but it's still tapping into kind of ancestral mechanisms.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, thank you very much for coming by and contributing.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
All right, we'll have to talk again soon on another topic.
Sounds good, man.
All right. So getting back to this.